I'm very pleased to introduce the general who haven't commanded the forces, but was the leader and the coordinator of the coalition that the President of the United States created to fight ISIS. And we have a wonderful learning opportunity here, since we heard the President in the State of the Union saying that it is not World War III, and former head of Mossad just told us that it is a third world war. And General Allen is a Marine, a Special Forces, a general who fought many months in Afghanistan, in Iraq. He's a hero. We used to work together in some areas that will be in my book 40 years from now. But we kept our friendship for many years, and I thank you very much for coming here tonight. And can we start with your opinion, since you retired from your job 2 months ago?
November.
So now you are not, you don't have to say what your president have said. You don't have to be with Tamir. You can really tell us what you think. World War III?
Well, first, let me thank you for the invitation. As Director Pardo said, friendship sometimes drags you into a forum that you might not otherwise want to be present in. But let me also say that virtually all that you said, Director, I agree with. And Mr. Lowy, thank you very much for all that you have done for this organization. I heard the aspiration that INSS ought to rank with the global think tanks. I think you've achieved that already, frankly, and it's because of your leadership, the leadership of the board, and the leadership of your director, who's a great leader. I do believe that we're facing a globalization of this threat that is, whether we call it World War III or a comprehensive globalization, we have to pay attention to what is happening with regard to Daesh, the Arabic acronym. When the coalition formed, when we brought together the 65 partners of the coalition, which are 63 countries, plus the EU and the Arab League, it came together because Daesh at the time was at its core located primarily in Iraq and Syria. In the intervening period, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi did something that was very smart. He declared that the organization was to become a caliphate, and he to become the caliph. And that created a spiritual momentum to this organization it could never have achieved being described purely as a terrorist organization that is heavily armed and well organized. And it is heavily armed and it's well organized. And my dear friend Dave Petraeus is there. And I think we would say that in the context of fighting Al-Qaeda, Daesh is an order of magnitude in capability well beyond it. But in creating the caliphate, it has created the opportunity now for global recruitment that we would not have seen otherwise. The whole business of one of your forces of social media has created not just the capacity to flatten the arrangements with respect to Daesh's organization, but to recruit into every home around the world where social media is available. So the challenge for us today is not just to fight and defeat Daesh in its core area. It is for us and the leadership of the states involved to understand the changing operational environment in which Daesh now exists, which is an operational environment that gives it strategic and global reach. There are really three major components to the organization as it exists today and as it has evolved in the last 14 months or so. And the first is what we call the core element of Daesh, which exists geographically in Iraq and Syria. The second is a constellation of entities and groups that are of similar mind, of similar inclination, that have put their hands in the air and have sought to become affiliated with Daesh and the leading shura, the central shura of the organization, has accepted them as what they call distant provinces of the caliphate. And the caliphate, of course, relies on its legitimacy to be constantly in relentless attack against the apostates and the unbelievers, disbelievers, and to expand its territory and to expand the population that it dominates. And in an environment where in Iraq and Syria, that surface area is beginning to constrict, and in an area, in a region where more and more of the population is being liberated, it makes sense now that they have to extend themselves into these distant provinces, which range across North Africa, in the Sinai, in the Arabian Peninsula, in the Caucasus, which the Russians now must deal with as well, in the Central and South Asian areas, the Khorasan, as it's called, and now increasingly in Southeast Asia. And we have seen it manifest itself in Jakarta this week. That's the second element, this constellation of groups that have been formally affiliated as distant provinces, wilayats, if you will, of the caliphate. But then the third piece is the piece that, again, the director alluded to, and it's one that we're very attentive to in Washington, and it's something that we must understand better, and it is the network which gives operational capacity and capability to Daesh. It is the network which connects the core with the constellation of provinces. It is the network by which command and control occurs, the shifting of resources occurs, the movement of fighters occurs, and ultimately the consolidation of the Daesh narrative. And that network often is laminated on top of criminal networks throughout the world that have long since preceded the emergence of Daesh. So the point is, while it would have seemed to have appeared that dealing with Daesh as a core element could have been handled in many respects through military capacity, now that Daesh, as we say, which has jumped the fence and has become a global threat, whether it's World War III or not, I'd love to engage you in a conversation because I think you're onto something. The reality is a very different system of organization has to occur, a comprehensive organization of intelligence services, ministries of interior and justice, and law enforcement to deal with the criminality of the organization, to be in relentless, continuous attack against the network, to disrupt that network constantly. So there can't be a second Paris, and there won't be another San Bernardino, because those all resulted, obviously, from the formal and the informal network. So it is the challenge that we face today.
Okay, so you agree with Tamir, and I have to agree with your president. I think that maybe we are doing something wrong, because at the end of the day, you led a coalition of 65 countries, or 63 and 2 organizations. There is another coalition led by Russia with the bad guys, with Iran and Syria and Hezbollah. How come that the whole world fighting a caliphate, which I think they have made a big mistake, because we are not so good fighting terrorists who use criminals way. We know very well how to deal with states. How come that 63 plus 4 are not defeating? They were 5,000 when they took Mosul. They are now 30,000. The whole world, my assumption, and I will be very happy to hear your thought about it, that nobody puts them as the number one priority of their national security goal, to defeat them. Nobody. Not the United States, not the Russians, not the Turks who are looking at the Kurds and Assad. Nobody describes them as number one and has the commitment to defeat them.
Is that the question?
Yes.
Great. A couple of things, several things. It's important to recognize that our efforts as a coalition are not focused entirely or solely on the military outcome. And as the director said, the U.S. believes that a military outcome is what is necessary. I think you said that. I would say to you that we believe that the military effort provides you an enabling platform for the accomplishment of other things. And we absolutely agree with you that the political outcome that we seek, or the outcome that we seek, is both a political and an economic outcome to have been accomplished through the physical, in some measure, the physical defeat of Daesh. But the physical defeat of Daesh is not only what needs to occur. And the coalition is organized along 5 lines of effort, all of which are occurring simultaneously and in mutual support of each other. And the first is the military line. And it is a mistake to believe that that's all that we're doing. The second is the effort to undermine Daesh's financial resources and to strangle its capacity for operational decisions because of its access to resources. And I know we don't have much time here today. That could be a full-hour conversation and a full-hour presentation. But that effort to detach Daesh from the international financial system from the top and to attack its capacity to generate finances from the bottom is underway now, and it is a comprehensive approach. The third area is in the area of seeking to impede or slow the flow of foreign fighters into the region. And much of that has been accomplished by our empowering, in the case of Syria, empowering the YPG and Syrian and free Syrian, Syrian Kurdish elements, free Syrian elements, that has now closed the border all the way from Iraq to the Euphrates River, and elements of that force have now crossed the Euphrates and they're heading towards Daesh key locations west of the Euphrates. And then the process ultimately of stabilizing populations. To the director's point, we believe that defeating Daesh physically is only part of the problem or part of the solution. Rescuing the population, creating opportunities for their economic restoration, improvement of their quality of life, the restoration of essential services is a very important point. By rescuing the population and defeating Daesh, you come a long way towards the end. And then the final area, which is perhaps one of the most important of the 5, is the countering of the narrative. And that's been a very difficult process for us because of the access of social media into virtually every single home. And Daesh's ability to have a coherent message and our inability to create the kind of coherent message necessary to compete in the information space. It's a real challenge for us. So it is a comprehensive approach. It is intended to buy us the time through military action and the support of indigenous forces to have the effect on Daesh necessary to begin to have a strategic effect over time. Your point about our perspective or our particular prioritization of Daesh is a very important one. Daesh believes that it is at total war with the rest of the world. The rest of the world believes that Daesh in some respects is an irritant. And until the kind of prioritization can be assumed in our capitals, and until we're able to put the kinds of resources into this that are necessary, we're going to have that difficulty.
Let me build on your last sentence. Now I understand that Daesh will be there a year from now. Right, Tamir? Assume that the next president of the United States, whoever he or she, will pick the phone and call you a year from now. Say, General, unfortunately, we are in the same situation. We are not defeating ISIS. I need your 3 best advice, what to do that we haven't done until now. What will be your advice?
First thing I would probably do is not answer the phone. I've stopped answering phone numbers that look like they're from U.S. institutions. I'd have several things to say. The first would be, Mr. President, Madam President, immediately convene the coalition. Bring together the global leaders, bring them into one place. Let's talk about what we've done. Let's establish the priority of defeating Daesh as the priority for the coalition. Let's project into the future what needs to be done to effect that defeat. Let's bring together the resources necessary, and let's get after it. But my first recommendation is convene the coalition, Madam President or Mr. President. The second would be never miss the opportunity and never be satisfied that we have done enough to optimize and to coordinate all measures of national power that can be brought to bear to defeat this enemy. That requires that we're constantly looking at not just our strategy, but constantly looking at the implementation of the strategy to ensure that we're getting the most out of all of the measures of national power and all of the measures of the whole of governments that are part of the coalition. So let's constantly look at our implementation to get the most out of our ability to fight across those 5 lines of effort. Another recommendation I would give to the President would be do what we can to get the Arabs involved in this. This, in the end, cannot be solved unless the Arabs solve it. It cannot be solved unless the Sunnis are critical to the process. These are Sunni extremist organizations. They have to be part of the solution. Now, many of our Arab partners several months ago were hived off from the coalition insofar as they began operations, comprehensive operations in Yemen. And that took a lot of the resources and it took a lot of the attention that had otherwise been committed into the coalition. It took a lot of that to the south. And I believe that as that process begins to resolve itself or as more capability becomes available, the more that the Arabs play in the solution. It's probably difficult in Iraq right now, but it is not difficult necessarily in Syria. The more we can get them to play in the solution, the more they become the solution, and it can't be a Western-led coalition that ultimately is the solution. It's got to be a regional solution. And then at a more tactical level, I would suggest to our Commander-in-Chief that, and you've seen this and others in this room with great experience have seen this, organizations like this sometimes have a pretty hard outer shell, but when you can crack that shell, it creates the potential for exploitation that if properly exploited, if properly taken advantage of, can begin a sequence of events that can begin the collapse of the organization. And I would suggest to our coalition leadership that we need to be poised. First, we need to be able to sense the fact that this organization potentially is beginning to have these difficulties and be able to move very quickly with great violence against that particular spot on the ground to begin to accelerate the collapse of this organization. And then finally, the point would be what the director talked about and what I mentioned before. We have to redouble our efforts to understand the operational environment in which Daesh has now gone global. We need to understand what that means in terms of who is attached to Daesh as a province, a distant province. But very importantly, we have to understand the network and go into a relentless process of disruption of that network.
Is Russia fighting ISIS, or they have different goal in coming to Syria?
Well, I would ask the Russians actually that question. A couple of things I would say. Our hope had been as Russians closed on the theater that there would be a very close partnership in the campaign against Daesh. In fact, there were really 3 expectations. The first, it was that. The second was that through Russian influence, we could perhaps see Bashar al-Assad begin to stop the barrel bombing, to reduce the violence against the innocent elements of the population in Syria. And then the third was to join us in a process of conversation on a political transition in Damascus, which would see a transition of Bashar al-Assad out of the political environment. That's not how it ended up. We would love to see the Russians do much more against Daesh and much less against some of the groups that we believe are part of the future of Syria. We would love to see more pressure on Bashar to stop the indiscriminate barrel bombing and indiscriminate attack of innocent, unarmed civilian populations. But I do believe that the incursion of the Russians into the theater has, in fact, created an opportunity for the community of nations, the external states associated with this conflict, to begin the process of the conversation for a political transition. It's very difficult. Getting certain of the parties in the same room at the same time is a real challenge, and it's become more complicated recently. But I do believe that the Russian appearance in the theater has created that opportunity, and I believe, at least in the U.S. level, at the U.S. level, our Secretary of State has seen that and is exerting pretty important leadership to that end. So we'd love to see the Russians spend a little more time dropping on Daesh. That has not been the case. In fact, the minority of the targets are Daesh targets. But we will, within the coalition, we will remain focused on dealing with Daesh, and whatever combat power the Russians apply, we will be grateful for.
Thank you. Let me conclude with the Israeli perspective. The Israeli approach was, it is better the devil we know than the devil we don't know. Some Israelis thought that maybe the devil we don't know will be better than Bashar. Now we know both devils. Who should we choose? Or let me put it in a different way. Can we get rid of both of them?
Both of whom?
Of Daesh and Assad.
Well, our hope had been that the process would be concurrent, that we had to prosecute the strategy against Daesh because Daesh is a threat to the entire region. It's a threat to Israel. And it's important for the coalition of nations to prosecute that as an active campaign. At the same time, it had been our intent, and I believe it is still our intent, to begin and to ultimately prosecute the conversation that can begin a succession process. I don't believe they should be sequential. I think that we should pursue both of them concurrently. And I think it's a false choice, frankly. I think it's a false choice that somehow Bashar needs to be left in place until Daesh is defeated, because in many respects, Daesh is a function of Bashar being in place. And the numbers of individuals who have died either by Bashar's hand or by virtue of the violence that has emerged in the wake of his failure to listen to moderate Syrian voices in the spring of 2011, that has created a list of casualties that is in the hundreds of thousands of now. So I think it's a false choice that we support Bashar until we eliminate Daesh. We shouldn't have the choice be a tyrant or a terrorist organization. We should be going after both simultaneously, and the two have to be related in our processes.
Thank you very much, General. I think we now understand why the President have called him from retirement to lead the coalition. And thank you for enjoying the evening. And we are just in the beginning of the program.